In Gregory Brown's novel, The Lowering Days, protagonist David Almarin Ames and his family live in Maine along the Penobscot River. He and his brothers have an affinity for the natural world. It's a love influenced by their parents, Arnaud and Fallon. The family has an abiding respect, too, for the people of the Penobscot Nation and the wider community. Fallon runs a community newspaper that gives voice to the Indigenous and white issues in and around Penobscot. But then something happens that's beyond the control of any one of these characters. How will the family survive the events that have been set in motion? This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. In the lowering days, in the Penobscot Valley at one time, the largest employer had been a paper mill, one that had been known to poison the river. When the building is burned to the ground right before it's to be reopened, the community is ripped apart. Fallon receives a letter from a Penobscot teen who confesses to the crime. She perceives it as an act of justice for what's happened to the river, but also for centuries of what she considers to be other assaults. The divide within the community threatens to break apart the Ames family, too. Will the weight of history and these new contentions threaten the enduring love of the Ames family and their connections to the community they so earnestly love? I spoke to author Gregory Brown about his novel, The Lowering Days. I think I'm going to start off by saying to you that your acknowledgments page is as gorgeous as this novel. I just had to mention that. It is as poignantly beautiful as the rest of the book. I have to say that. And I read a lot of acknowledgments and I don't always find that to be the case. So
I'm so happy you had that experience. One of the first things I always do when I'm reading a book is actually read the acknowledgments. So it's a moment I've been looking forward to for a long time. So to hear that it registered deeply with someone, that's the first I've heard that. That's really beautiful. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I really mean it. And I'm like you. I sometimes go all the way back to the acknowledgments first before I do anything else. I'm not sure why I do that, but I do that too. So tell us about the lowering days. There is mention of the title of it as the name of the newspaper where the character of Fallon works, newspaper where she manages. But tell us about The Lowering Days first, the novel, and then we can talk about that.
Sure. For me, the Lowering Days has kind of always been a bit of a love letter to the place I grew up, which is the Penobscot River Valley. It's a fictionalized version of that place that I'm writing about, but I don't want to get too much into the plot, but it focuses on kind of the intersection of three families in a small fictional town in the Penobscot River Valley, a place where the land is very much alive, and the land has also been very much used over time as a resource, exploited, degraded, and it asks this question of who does land belong to, and what does it mean to protect land? What does it mean to live together with land in a way that one is upholding or shepherding it, and also like why is it so often that we see in small towns a continued cycle of resentment and often violence, and why is it so hard for people to embrace compassion as opposed to those more damaging impulses. But the title specifically refers to a small town newspaper that the protagonist's mother runs, called The Lowering Days. It also kind of folds through the book in other ways as a bit of a motif. It's also the name, of the day that a boat would be lowered into the ocean. The protagonist's father, Arnaud, is a boat builder. And it also has a connotation as, funeral day, the day a body would return to the earth. So it has all these echoes that I hope weave through the book in a satisfying way.
They really do. I mean, it's set up for us, just to look at the book, The Lowering Days is such a striking title to begin with.
Thank you.
And then Reggie, Fallon's brother, is the one who says, when she says she wants to call it The Lowering Days, wants to call the newspaper The Lowering Days, he says, that sounds ominous. And she goes on to explain, by way of the protagonist, David, of course, As you said, it's a name that came from her great grandfather, who had been a doctor up in the Penobscot in Prospect and also routinely presided over funerals, gathering the townspeople in mourning on these lowering days, as he called them, when a body was sent into the earth. Other times, she said the name came from the berthing day for a boat, the lowering day when the finished hull was first slipped into the waiting sea, which I like too because of the connection to the work that Arnaud does. Well, here we are, roughly the 80s, but the
Hmm.
call for eco-activism is really strong in this novel. I'm not sure people realize that the movements that we see today for reckonings of various kinds are rooted back decades ago, too. Certainly in a place like Penobscot, the tensions, at least I imagine, must have always existed. And as you write about the character of Fallon in her work, this was the time of the clean water movements.
Absolutely. It was the time of the clean water movements. It was also the time in Maine, specifically as the Maine Indian Land Claims Act settlement, when the main tribes were on the verge of, and they ultimately were awarded huge financial reparations that were primarily used to buy land back. So the question of defending the environment and the question of returning land to its, I don't want to say rightful, but it's rightful shepherds was very alive at that time period, um, for sure. And it's interesting too, like this question of what is an act of like eco defense and what is an active environmental terrorism, and how different languages or different words are applied to different actions. So I wanted that question to kind of be at the heart of the book. Kind of the morality of a crime and of upholding something that needs a human defense. In this case, it's a paper mill that's been contaminating the river, and down through the bay for many generations, because of all the harm that's been caused by the human element. So yeah, there's a direct correlation between that time period and what we're continuing to see as far as environmental activism and the great strides that I think are being made today.
And you make the story so accessible because that's a topic that can put some people
Yeah,
off.
I know it can be a snooze fest, right? It can shut an interview down. It can
No.
make a book. It's tricky. It's very complicated.
But you make it so accessible. You take on such a hefty topic, and but then there are these other stories. There's family. I'm going to call it family function because these are David's family is so, there's something just so beautiful and magical about it. But then, there's a fine line toward, the fraying edges toward dysfunction too, and we see some of that play out. But I love all of the attendant emotions of the family story that works parallel to the story of the degradation of the environment and the way that the indigenous population there responds and reacts and is hurt and fights and struggles. And it's in this part of the country where I feel like there's this magical connection to the natural world. I've read a few books about Maine very recently, and I keep coming back to this idea. And your novel is another one where the characters are so connected to the land, to the ghost apple tree and to these other things, the ocean whispering to David. It's just something that is part of the story. I mean, it's intrinsic to the story, and you really can't even divorce any of these elements, even if they seem a little surreal sometimes. You really can't divorce them from the rest of the story. I just found that so interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's super true. Especially in a place like Maine, where you know people have depended on land-based industries for so long, and I think they're well aware of the aliveness of land and how it supports them and how it holds them, but also how they need to take from it at times to make a living. So it pervades so much of life in the Northeast in that way. And again, it kind of gets to your reading of like how dysfunction is right underneath functioning families is really spot on, and I appreciate that close reading. And it does extend to the land. We have what a lot of people would argue are functional relationships with the land. When we talk about natural resources councils, or we talk about forestry management, but underneath that is really a dysfunctional relationship because we're continuing to take from something in a harmful way. But yeah, in almost all of the families in the book, um, there's this like deep love where I was hoping would come through, but there's also this moment when it can quickly become ugly, become violent, become resentful. And even throughout the novel, among the narrator's family, there are often moments where a way of showing one love is, through physical violence. There's a time when like Simon, the oldest brother, assaults and physically holds back his youngest brother to keep him from going somewhere. And there's all these moments where we see physical restraint as a way of expressing love, which happens, and it's a damaging lineage that a lot of families are living with in small towns.
That was a very surprising moment in the book because there is just this profound love that's so palpable among this family and the brothers, the twins and Simon. The characters are so rich in this book, and I just found each one to be so endlessly fascinating. For example, David's parents are Arno and Fallon, and their stories, each story is so poignant. And in Arno's case, it answers some questions about him to know his origin story as we then learn about him as such an attentive husband and father, such a loving husband and father. And then Fallon is a force. I mean, she's someone who is at the center of things because in some ways her decisions are what incite a lot of what happens in this book. So there's so much about family. Yes, I absolutely agree that it is the story. In some ways it is the story. And then, of course, the intersections with Lyman and his family. Where on earth did these characters come from? They're so interesting, just in terms of how deeply they love, and also how that very love, to use the example of Simon going to use physical violence against his younger brother to keep him from then getting in more trouble. Where did these characters come from? I'm very curious about the twinship too, because I'm a twin, and I'm always curious about, this is the main character, David, who is a twin, and I just found that to be such an interesting choice.
Yeah. Where did they come from? They came very slowly. Actually, I spent many years, well, about 7 in total, writing this book, and I would have kind of little echoes of who different characters were, would slowly come, and I spent a lot of time just thinking about them and kind of letting their characters coalesce before I wrote them. And that tends to kind of be how I work in general. Like I'll have these I'll be in conversation with myself about a character for years. What if this character does this? Or what if Almi is a twin? What if Arno protects his family or loves his family so hard because he didn't have a family? His family was taken from him. So they very slowly emerged in that regard. And one thing I wanted was, and I hope it comes through, is that there's a complexity between what they want and what they have, and an interplay between that. Fallon wants deeply to be a partner. She wants to be in partnership with Arno. She loves her husband. She loves her children. She wants to be a mother, but at the same time, she has her own ambitions. She wants to make real change through journalism at the small town level, which she believes is fundamentally possible. So she's also this mother who is at times very not present because she's absorbed in her own passions. And I think the most interesting people I've known in my lives have been able to walk both those lines, have a very full and deep love for their family that is kind of constant. So you can go away into your own individual world and into the own work you need to do in the world, and know you can come back, a better and more fully rounded person when you return to your family in ways. Um, but yeah, Arno's like deep love and his attentiveness as a father and a husband, it kind of also goes to his darker side in the book, or there was, my hope is it comes through when his family is threatened. It gets, ugly quick, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
He's a Vietnam veteran. Both him and Lyman are veterans, and they had different paths in the war. Lyman was kind of celebrated for his service, where Arno deserted. But back at home, Arno has been more celebrated as a person for what he's given to the community than Lyman. So they're kind of shadow figures in a way that parallel each other. And when they perceive threat to their family, it often kind of puts them on high alert, which I was hesitant to go too deeply into PTSD in the novel, but there is an element of that. When the thing that you care most about is threatened, your hypervigilance comes out, and that's the case for both Lyman and for Arno.
Well, not to give too much away about the last maybe third of the novel, but you're right. These characters are flawed in ways that move us from this sort of strict morality play, thank goodness, where everybody's all good or all bad. We want to have good guys and bad guys, but we want a real story about real people. So I appreciated being able to see these characters who's, Arno, who seems like he can do no wrong. And but then we see that just as in war, there's always this collateral damage. There's always a fuzzy thin line between what we can perceive as good or bad, or as only one thing. So even Lyman can be perceived in really sympathetic ways, and then even Arno isn't without some instances of very poor judgment. And the same can be said even of a character that I'm sure readers will find to be a beloved one, somebody like Moses, or somebody like Molly, or Adam, or anyone in the story, really. In fact, in one part, David is looking at his twin brother Link and notices, I wrote down the quote here, how grown up he looked, and that in our games, one side was good and one side was evil. I kept thinking about this idea and how it shows the complexity of each character here, and that they each possess so many dimensions. So I actually appreciate that, the complexity of every single one of these. Even Fallon, part of the time it's like, oh yes, Fallon, she's the champion for all working mothers, and then in other moments I'm like, oh, Fallon, so
Right.
I totally, and it was Fallon because of things I sort of recognize in myself, these flaws. So no, I think that lends so much to this story about the ways all of these families intersect.
Yeah, thank you. I had so much fun writing Fallon, and as a character, and now that I'm away from this novel and have been for a while now, I find myself missing her more than any of the other characters, interestingly enough. But yeah, it's so easy, right, to get trapped in binary thinking, and that just as we go through our daily lives, like something is this or it is that. Mm-hmm. And again, like I'm always trying to force my characters not to adopt binary ways, to make space for a perspective that includes a multitude of perspectives or some gray area. And again, like in regards to how Lyman and Arno kind of shift and fall from grace, for lack of a better phrase, at times, and other characters who do harmful things or hurtful things in the novel. Like we know that hurt people, right? That harm compounds down through, and we're seeing that in all three of these families, where they're taking the hurt that's been done to them, and oftentimes extending that. And the three families there are two non-Indigenous families, the Ames family and the Creel family, and then there's a Penobscot family, that's Molly and Adam, who you referenced, and Moses is effectively Molly's godfather in ways, and he's also Penobscot.
I kept wondering if it's if it's a Maine thing, spending any amount of time in this part of the country inspires this reverence and this knowledge of the way that human history merges with the land, not always positively right, but in ways that speak to the complexity of coexisting and of society and of colonization and all, that whole story. But in this book, I feel like could it be something about that connection to the land that is very distinctively Maine. I mean, even the animals in this book, Cricket, the horse, and
Mhm.
Sam and Daphne, the two dogs. I mean, even those moments in the novel just absolutely swept me up, and and became sort of the focus for those paragraphs or those pages. It just seems like there's this extra quality of specialness about people who are in tune with the natural world, like Arnaud in this case with Sam the dog, and even with Cricket earlier on, and then of course we see how David has sort of inherited this connection to Cricket. It's just something so so special in this book. Again, the ghost apple tree and the rest. I just found it to be, you don't have to, and I don't think you have to be particularly open to the idea of the specialness or the surreal qualities of it. It's just something that you can appreciate and I think almost envy in a way, to be so close to the natural landscape, the river, and the land, and I mean, even the more difficult aspects of this, the rugged outdoors and the cold, I think is something that comes through in such a beautiful way in this book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate how much you noticed the aliveness of the two-legged characters and the four-legged characters. It was important to capture. It was important for me to try to, as well as I could, capture like the aliveness and the sentience of all of the entities that are alive in the book, whether it's a dog or a horse or our human characters or the land. But yeah, I think there's something very deeply rooted in the natural world. I mean, I still live in Maine, and I grew up here, and I returned here after grad school, and I'd been away for a decade, kind of living other places, and what I found when I came back was, I was hit very powerfully again by how connected I felt to the earth, and how much more connected I felt to the earth here than in other places I lived. And I don't know if that's just because, I had more time, I had been busier, other places I lived, or what it was, but there was an aliveness there that was impossible to miss. And it was kind of, some of the inciting moments for the book actually were just how kind of magical elements started to kind of shine out in my imagination among nature. And I say magical elements. I'm talking about, like, the ghost apple tree, a tree that keeps its fruit and stays alive even through the deepest freeze of winter. Or there's other moments in the book where somewhat surreal or strange things happen, often around or as embodiments of the natural world. And those things never felt strange to me growing up. They still don't. I still have moments when the very strange feel very familiar, and what we might think of as more magical elements don't feel any stranger than the reality, or like the empirical reality that we know. So I think it's really interesting how there's definitely an aliveness to the world, and kind of the world under the world we know, that I think often manifests in natural spaces. And I think fiction has this ability to really capture those worlds beneath worlds really
Mm-hmm.
well. There's that ability to go deeply into the interior of a thing, a person, or a place. And there's also like all this space to world build. So if you have a place where fantastic things happen and are very normal in how they're perceived, and then normal things happen and kind of feel a little strange, fiction's a great place to kind of bring that contradiction to life.
Yeah, and I was thinking about how if you have a place like this and these really sort of these people in their small worlds, basically living through these big moments. And I forget who said it. Maybe it was David who said, I'm so tired of everything ending up being a really big moment, or really everything just feels so heavy, everything that happened. And I kept thinking of, that sounds like some of the things my students have told me. Like, is this what it's like to be a grown-up? A pandemic, a weather disaster, an impeachment, an I'm tired of some of all the big things. When do small things happen? But there is something very mythic that happens in this book. And there's a lot here too that has to do with the lore of the Penobscot River and Valley. For example, you mentioned the ghost apple tree, and I was thinking too of the one to do with the banshee who's accompanied Fallon's family
Yeah,
for all these.
Screech, yeah, who comes over.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the sea is a kind of whisper to David. And I was thinking about something that David, the narrator, says to us by way of Wren, and this comes a little later in the novel, that has to do with this idea that, and I have the quote here, we can only account for about 7% of all the matter in the known universe. What this means is that you'd be a fool to believe that way you can see, feel, and comprehend is more important than what you cannot. Probability would dictate that what exists in the other 93% of matter may hold great importance. So the perplexing truth is that there are quite possibly other worlds playing out that we can't see or even begin to comprehend. And this is something that so many of the characters seem to understand, if not super
Mm,
explicitly and pointedly, certainly very implicitly. I mean, they just sort of embody these ideas.
yeah, yep, absolutely. And 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 I think one of the reasons, that David is hungry for a quieter moment is, all of these characters are carrying so much history with them. They're kind of caught up in this stream of, centuries of big moments, and those big moments are running under the surface of their lives with an awareness that they have, and they're also kind of culminating in the plot of the book. And I very much wanted the place to, the place I'm writing about, to have this kind of mythic, almost larger than life feel, to kind of create its own mythography in a way. And I'm really touched to hear that came through in the reading, because that's important to me. I always love, I love works of fiction in which, they have their own world, their own myths, their own folklore, their own like lineages that the characters are carrying forward. And yeah, Ren is always kind of pointing out the obvious in ways to David, and then the wondrous. And yeah, that's a passage that kind of gets right at some of the heart of the book, and how little we know, and how sometimes thinking we have everything figured out, leads to catastrophic circumstances and collisions.
Mm-hmm. I kept going back to the very beginning of the novel. I mean, David has said to us, "I am a doctor," and
Yeah,
we already know and we're so immersed in his world as a 14-year-old and on that, to come back to that point, a person a doctor, a person who has to be very rational and has to look at the empirical side of things, and has to
right.
be, but he's also so sensitive to the very things that Ren is explaining to him, and that we've seen him live throughout the novel, for the whole duration of the novel. He's such an open character. He's so open to the things that his mother tells him, or that he understands about his mother because of what Reggie has told him. And he's just such a lovely and memorable character in that way, and we get to see him sort of full circle, or as an adult, and realize that even though his path has taken him to a place that's sort of moved him away from what his father used to do, or maybe even some of his mother's idealism. He still possesses so much from his two parents.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, David or Almi, as he goes by as a nickname. Um, it was important for me to have him continue to be open, and to be absorbent of everything that he was being told and everything that was happening around him. And there's a passage pretty early on in the book where he talks about, how he's hoping, he's retrospectively looking back, he's about events that happened when he was a teenager in the novel. And he says that I'm hoping to stand in the flow of history, or the weight of history, and move through these lives that made up my life, similar to, the river that kind of flowed through all their lives and connected them. So he's taking on this kind of terrifying task, I think, of allowing yourself to go deeply into all of the people that were and are your immediate family and your community, and try to see them for, all their beautiful moments and their flawed moments. And it sounds like that narrative choice worked really well for you, and I'm really happy to hear that.
It really did. I mean, I kept thinking about how he's living with parents who live that idea of community. And
Right.
so they can be in their small world on their property, which seems a little isolated. And, and they're, the secrets that families sort of have to have, the idiosyncrasies of families. But the ways that somebody like the character of Grace, for instance, can still be almost, in spite of everything, like a second mother ultimately, or
Yeah.
that she could still, even though there's tremendous backstory and conflict with Lyman, Grace's husband, that even Grace can come through. Like, the community is so strong, even when we realize that maybe they're suspicious of each other, they're not fully trusting of each other, they do have to coexist. And this is true of how they interact with somebody like Molly and Moses and Adam. I mean, that we are all on this earth at the same time. And David Almi is somebody who seems to really understand that if we don't treat each other as a community, then what are we doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the goal is, and that I think is something that has a deep tradition in my life, and in the lives of many people, well, people everywhere, obviously, but in Maine as well. How tied to our communities we are, and how aware we are of the fact that we have to live with one another despite drastic differences in values. And yeah, that it's interesting that you mentioned too, kind of the sanctuary that Arno and Fallon create. They create how they build a house on a peninsula in the river where they're going to raise their kids, and it's kind of, it gets into the darker side of a sanctuary or an obsession. Is, you make this what you think is a perfect place to try to contain your life, but at the same time you're closing out the rest of the world. You're losing perspective. And for two people who live in a place that are so dependent on community, I mean, that can have really dangerous ripples. So I found when I was writing the book that I wanted these families to go deeply into their own kind of sanctuary spaces, and then be forced to move back out into the community spaces. And that's something that creates, I hope at least, creates a certain amount of tension where they're moving inward, and then they're realizing they need to move back outward, and what they want to have in their closer, sanctuary style lives is in conflict with what the community needs in the moment. Kind of a rambly answer, but
No, that's exactly.
Understand what I'm kind of like hinting towards.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. And that's the paradox, right?
Right, of sure.
So, well, I want to ask you about Lyman. He's someone from Fallon's past, and he's very much in this story. He carries this kind of dark cloud around him for a good part of the story because these very dramatic things that occur between him and Molly. But we learn that his whole life, pretty much, he's carried around the weight of his family's judgment, and of the town too. Everyone. He's already a very volatile guy, but then things happen that ramp up all the tension whenever he's in a scene. These characters carry a lot of heavy baggage, so we were talking before about how they're so complex. They're in no way one-dimensional. They have all this. They're all trying to do the right thing. Everybody here is trying to do the right thing. And Lyman has some heavy baggage that doesn't always allow for that. So that complexity and the paradox of what you were just talking about and of these characters, I think, is what lends such a richness to this novel.
Thank you. Yeah, Lyman's kind of this, in ways, this tragic embodiment of how hard it can be to escape one's past, or the past that's been applied to one in a small town. And for all the good Lyman does in his community, and he does a lot. He kind of rejects his family's money and history of mill ownership to become a fisherman, and he organizes a lobster cooperative and collaborates in a lot of community building ways. And he still can't escape from some of the darker elements of his past, and then he does further harm that compounds those darker elements. And it's an interesting question for Lyman. I've always been curious, and you think I would know since he's my character, but at times I'm still not sure if Lyman, causes the harm. He's like the dark cloud that brings the storm, or if the storm is outside Lyman, kind of creating the dark cloud. And I think a lot of people in the community in the book struggle with that too. Ultimately, he does some harmful things, but he has a lot of tenderness as a character too, and strange obsessions with things like ravens and raising birds. And there's these moments where his love of people and places and things is pretty apparent. But Lyman and Fallon were probably the most difficult characters to write in writing this novel, or the most difficult to figure out. And I think they were the most, if I mention how fun Fallon was to write, but there was something fascinating about writing Lyman, in that his psychology and the places he goes are so very dark at times.
Oh, I can so imagine that. And I also I don't know if this was intentional, the nod to the character of Lyman in The Red Convertible by Louise Erdrich.
It wasn't intentional.
I still love it.
Love that. I feel like I should have been aware of that. I love that story. I love Louise Erdrich's work. And of all of the stories in love medicine, that's one that resonated most deeply with me when I first read it.
Well, there are other Lymans.
I think it's an unconscious nod for sure.
Well, there are other Lymans in literature, but I like this. I like this idea anyway. So
I like it too. I'm gonna start going with that.
Well, Gregory Brown, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Gregory Brown is the author of The Lowering Days. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Bree Kirkham is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.